Everybody, welcome. My name is Jennifer Kaur. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society. I'm going to go over a few brief housekeeping things here, and then we'll get right into our program. This is the last in our Tennessee 101 series for, I guess, the fall and spring semester. We will pick up again in August of this year. Whoops, stop. Okay, well, we don't really need to look at this because there aren't any more for you to register for. But if you have missed any of our sessions, if you go to our webpage and you go directly to that particular session, you'll see down at the bottom of it, let's keep on going. You'll see down at the bottom where we've posted a recording of that. So if you have an interest in any of these particular topics and missed out, it's still there for you on our YouTube channel. We do have coming up, if you have a question or a comment during this particular session, if you'll just drop it into our Q&A box, we'll be monitoring that throughout this particular session. And my coworker, Nikki, is going to be dropping some resources in there for you as well. So keep an eye on the Q&A box. If you want to follow us on social media, our handles are here. This is a really good way to find out about programs that we have coming up. We have one last program for this spring semester, and that is part of Tennessee Talks. This is open to members of Tennessee Historical Society. This is led by Dr. Carol Busey, who is the Davidson County historian, and this is our book club or our discussion group for texts devoted to Tennessee history. Next week, we'll be talking about The Hawks Done Gone by Mildred Hahn, which is an early classic of Appalachian literature. We do want to thank our major sponsors for this program, Humanities Tennessee and the Tennessee Arts Commission. Without them, we could not put on programs like this for you. And now I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Langston Wilkins. I'm going to cheat Langston because otherwise I might accidentally promote you. I think Sean promoted you last time. He's the co-convener of this series and helps select and recruit the speakers. He's assistant professor of folklore and African American studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a post that he took up just in the fall. Prior to that, he was in Washington State as the state folklorist. And before that, he lived in Tennessee, where he worked at both of these illustrious institutions, Humanities Tennessee and the Tennessee Arts Commission. So I'm going to turn it over to Langston, who's going to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to introduce Carrie Allen Tipton, who writes lectures and teaches about music, religion, history, and culture, especially of the South. She has published in ESPN's The Undefeated, History Today, Pop Matters, Deep South Magazine, the Southern Foodways Alliance blog, Norton's Avid Listener, Religion Dispatches, the Black Music Research Journal, and the Journal of the Society for American Music, among many other publications. And her article on minstrel songs in Southern college football was a finalist in the 2022 Associated Press Sports Editors Contest. Dr. Tipton has also presented her work through the Houston Ebony Opera Guild, Nashville's Writer Fest, National Museum of African American Music, the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, the Society for American Music, and the Society for Ethnomusicology, among many other organizations and events. And she is also on the editorial board of the American Bach Society and hosts the Notes on Bach podcast for Bach Society Houston, which I think just completed its 6th season. And she also coordinates the Tiny Bach concert video series for the American Bach Society. A longtime church musician and pianist, Tipton holds a Ph.D. in musicology and ethnomusicology and a master's in music and piano performance from the University of Georgia, and a bachelor's in music education from Mississippi State University. And at Vanderbilt University, she teaches a course on music, sports, and society, which sounds super awesome. And related to that, her current book, From Dixie to Rocky Top, Music and Meaning in Southeastern Conference Football, is coming out in October of this year, 2023, through Vanderbilt University Press. But it's now available for pre-order, and we have a link in the chat where you can order that book at a 40% discount. So that being said, I welcome Dr. Tipton to present her work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank y'all for having me. It's great to be with you here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and make sure that we have our audio shared as well. And perhaps if one of the moderators could let me know if for some reason the audio doesn't come through, we can tweak some settings. So speaking of audio, I do want to give a disclaimer before we start this evening. The audio that you will hear tonight during the presentation is archival in nature. Some of it dates back almost a century. Some of it dates back to the 1930s and 40s, and a lot of it comes from radio broadcasts. So you're not going to be hearing super clear audio, and it might help if you put on a pair of headphones or earbuds. So I'm going to start. Before you hear much more from me, before I really get cranked up, I want you to hear from Francis Craig, who is the topic of our talk tonight. This is what you're going to hear. In spring 1948, Nashville band leader Francis Craig gave an interview on a Hollywood radio show called Meet the Music Makers. During the radio interview, Craig reminisced about writing his orchestra's theme song. The song was called Red Rose, and he wrote it back in 1928. And this is where I want to start tonight. We're going to listen to Francis Craig talk about his theme song, and we're going to hear his orchestra perform the song. It's about a 2-minute clip. The performance part of the audio that you're about to hear likely dates from a WSM radio broadcast in the late 1930s or early 1940s. Here we go.
Well, I have been married for 23 years, and one time about 20 years ago, about the third year after our marriage, we went back to Birmingham, Alabama to spend a little vacation at the home of my wife. So while there, it was a beautiful time of the year, and there were beautiful red roses in the front yard and in the backyard, and I just kind of got a little sentimental and wanted to write a tune about, in honor, maybe, of Elizabeth, my wife. So it took me about 4 days to write out this little melody, and it was inspired by my wife.
Francis Craig serenades with Red Rose.
So that was Francis Craig's orchestra performing his theme song, with vocals by Bob Lamb, who went on to have a distinguished career on his own. So from this audio, especially from the interview, we can hear why Craig's Southern background formed a key part of his public profile in the interwar music industry, and that's going to be a big part of what we talk about tonight. So now as we move forward, we will have the sound of his voice and his orchestra in our ears. So here's our roadmap for tonight. We're going to first do a quick overview of Francis Craig's biography and musical style. Second, we'll explore how he built his career in a web of Nashville institutions that were connected to the broader commercial music industry. And finally, we'll look at how Craig was marketed as Southern and what his career can tell us about the Southern production and consumption of popular music between the world wars. So first, a little overview of his life and his style. Francis Craig was born in 1900 in Dixon, Tennessee, outside of Nashville. He was the son of a Methodist minister. Growing up, he absorbed different styles, including classical piano training. Here you can see a program from his high school piano recital in 1916. Hopefully you can see that there are a number of classical composers represented there, and that his mother joined in at the end with a piece by the composer Liszt. At a young age, Craig could also mimic popular styles such as ragtime. This concerned his parents, especially when he applied these styles to the Methodist hymnal. Throughout his career, fans and media commented on his distinctive piano style. I'm going to play the introduction to his late 1940s song called Beg Your Pardon. In the introduction, you can hear his classical piano training come through in the opening arpeggios, and you can also hear a little bit of his absorption of boogie-woogie piano styles. After World War I, Craig entered Vanderbilt University, where he made lasting social connections and organized a dance orchestra. He left Vanderbilt in 1922 to pursue music professionally. For the next 25 years, Craig worked as a dance band leader, composer, and pianist for an elite white Southern clientele. And here you can see his union card, the Nashville local number 257 of the American Federation of Musicians. Although anchored in Nashville's social and musical institutions, Francis Craig became known widely throughout the South and to some degree nationally. After he retired from actively performing and recording in the late 1940s, he worked in administration at WSM Radio. He died in 1966. In terms of style, as you've already heard, Francis Craig was associated with what was called smooth or sweet dance orchestra music. As his biographer put it somewhat humorously, quote, Francis and his demographic targets swung very cautiously, end quote. But his style did evolve over time. His early recordings from the mid-1920s sound considerably hotter than his later records. These early records used Dixieland arrangements with solos that at least sound improvised. You can hear his group's mid-1920s sound in a recording of That Florida Lowdown that the group made for Columbia Records in 1925. Where's our audio? There it is. At that time, in the mid-1920s, the Nashville press often described his group as a jazz band or jazz orchestra. For example, in 1924, the Nashville Banner wrote that Craig's orchestra, quote, furnished riotous jazz at a fraternity dance. This was a phrase that certainly would not have been used of his group in later years when they did little that could have been called riotous. By the late 1920s, Craig was playing regular gigs in social settings that required reserved, mellow repertoire and arrangements. His orchestra did less improvising than you heard in this recording, and they played more sentimental numbers. They dropped the tuba, banjo, and violin that they had used in the 1920s. And the group settled out to include 4 saxophones with clarinet capability, 3 trumpets and a trombone, and a rhythm section made up of piano, bass, and drums. Craig often featured a solo vocalist, and he typically directed the band in a reserved fashion, often with a hand in his pocket. So that summarizes his style for you. I want to move now to look at a letter that Francis Craig received from a fan in February 1933. This letter highlights how his career was forged within a web of regional institutions that networked him to the national music industry, and this is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. The letter came from Mary Baugh Watson. She was Craig's first violin teacher way back in Tennessee, but by the time she wrote the letter, she had lived in Iowa for many years. In the letter, which you can see on the screen, she wrote, quote, I am writing to the accompaniment of your music, which we are enjoying very much. It makes me feel very proud, but rather aged to think that I was your first violin teacher, end quote. Although Watson had moved from Tennessee to Iowa many years before, she had continued to follow Craig's career on the radio. By the time of her 1933 letter, NBC Radio had carried Craig's Sunday night show as a national hookup from WSM in Nashville for a couple of years. Francis Craig received other similar fan letters that are in his archives now at Vanderbilt, and these letters show that although Craig and his childhood contacts had left small-town Tennessee as part of larger Southern migration patterns, the fans could still follow his career because of his strategic location in Nashville. It was a Southern hub in the interwar commercial music industry. And I want to talk about some of those institutions that made Nashville such a music hub that Craig was very networked into. A key part of this strategic position was Craig's job as house orchestra leader at Nashville's Hermitage Hotel. You can see an early image of it there on the left. The high-end Hermitage Hotel opened in 1910, a block from the Tennessee Capitol, and it is still there and still beautiful. Francis Craig started playing there in the early 1920s. You can see on the right a newspaper ad for a tea dance that his group was playing in the Hermitage's restaurant in 1923. In 1925, his group became the hotel's house orchestra. At this time, it was common for high-end hotels to retain these kinds of ensembles. Until 1948, which is really a remarkable run of over 20 years, Craig played music almost daily in the Hermitage restaurant for elite white patrons. Here, Nashville socialites and Tennessee politicians dined alongside hotel guests. Sometimes these guests included national celebrities such as Al Jolson, Eleanor Roosevelt, Gene Autry, Paul Whiteman, Al Capone, and Betty Davis, all of whom came through the Hermitage during Craig's tenure there as band leader. Hermitage guests were geographically and socially mobile. It is likely that Craig's connections there resulted in gigs in other cities. The Hermitage put Craig's name on its marquee, and he became a fixture there. Of course, Craig's group regularly played at other Nashville venues between the world wars. For example, in the mid-1930s, he played daily shows at Lowe's Theater. His group would play in between films, and this was another point of connection that he had with the national entertainment industry. Craig also frequently performed on Saturday nights at the Belmead Country Club, the social seat of Nashville's white elite. However, he is largely remembered in Nashville for his longtime Hermitage residency, which was formative both for the hotel and for Craig. One reason the hotel gig was so important for his career is that Nashville radio stations WLAC and WSM broadcast his hotel shows. And these are more of the Nashville institutions that we are focusing on that networked Craig into the national entertainment industry. His radio broadcasts gave listeners of a wider class and racial base a peek into the glamour of white Southern high society, and it made Craig a regional household name. Here you can see a 1928 newspaper ad for Francis Craig playing at the Hermitage, and you can see that this advertises a hookup over WLAC in Nashville. And I want you to notice the tagline of the ad, which is the Hermitage is where refinement predominates. So it kind of gives you a window into the class setting of this important gig. These radio hookups were part of Francis Craig's very extensive work with Nashville radio stations, especially the iconic WSM radio, a name that is known to many of you. Craig's uncle, Edwin Craig, was one of the owners of National Life Insurance. And Edwin Craig was the insurance executive who created WSM to promote the insurance company. So therefore, Francis Craig's group performed in WSM studios and on hookups from the station's very earliest days, starting with its 1925 launch. And Craig's group played jazz on the day that WSM radio launched in 1925. WSM's wide reach carried his sound across the South and further, especially as its wattage grew. Even in the station's very earliest months, it could already be regularly heard as far away as El Paso, Texas. The earliest surviving WSM program ledger is from 1928. It's in the Vanderbilt University Archives and Special Collections. You can see the cover of it there. It's quite large. It looks like an old-fashioned accounting ledger. And I want to spend some time digging into this ledger because it's a real window into Francis Craig's career at WSM and how that networked him beyond Nashville, kind of in a non-geographical sense. The ledger dates from 3 years after the station's launch, and it documents the 1928 broadcast schedule, and Francis Craig shows up in it quite a lot. The ledger gives us a real window into how his career flourished through Nashville's links to regional social networks and to the national entertainment industry. According to many entries in the ledger, in 1928, Craig's group broadcast from the WSM studios one night per week, usually from 30 minutes to an hour. Even at this early date, WSM reserved Saturdays for old-time music. This is what eventually became the Grand Ole Opry. Old-time music was aimed at workers who had more listening time on Saturdays, so Craig never broadcast on Saturdays because that's not the kind of music he played, and we'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Sometimes Francis Craig broadcast alone at the piano, as he did on January 30th, when he played a 15-minute solo night slot. Hopefully you can see the ledger entry there at the very top of the screen. It just says Francis Craig piano. Sometimes the ledger shows us that his group would be booked for airtime and then their name would be scratched out. Anything from illness to car trouble could have knocked them out of the broadcasting lineup. The 1928 ledger also records some of Craig's local radio hookups, which means that he would broadcast outside of the WSM studios and WSM would bring equipment to that location and broadcast his performance remotely. For example, in February, his orchestra played an American Legion dance at Nashville's Hippodrome, and hopefully you can see that notated in the ledger. The broadcast went from 10:30 to midnight on WSM radio. The ledger gives us a glimpse of another key part of Craig's work, a really key part. And this was playing for white college dances in the Southeast, with Vanderbilt University as a sort of hub for this activity. In the 1920s and 1930s, Francis Craig's group traveled to play at many, many social events and dances at the universities of Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Sewanee, North Carolina State, Auburn University, which at the time was Alabama Polytechnical Institute, and Georgia Tech. In this era, pop stars such as Rudy Vallée, Fred Waring, and Bing Crosby, these were national stars, were known for their collegiate-themed songs and collegiate public images. You can see Rudy Vallée there with a megaphone, which he was frequently pictured with in his publicity photos. On the right, you can see one of the many college songs that Rudy Vallée recorded. This is Yale's Whiff and Poof song, kind of their Glee Club's banner song. And just an example of the type of collegiate repertoire that was part of mainstream commercial music in the interwar period and the type of repertoire that Francis Craig also played for college crowds. Francis Craig was a regional version of this national trend. He played the same songs and styles for Southern collegiates that the big-time collegiate crooners did, like Fred Waring and Rudy Valley and Bing Crosby. So, for example, in spring 1928, the WSM Ledger shows us that Francis Craig did hookups from the Vanderbilt gym where you could hear him playing for fraternity dances at Vanderbilt. If you tuned into WSM at night, you would hear him playing these frat dances. So the top Ledger entry is the Sigma Alpha Epsilon dance from spring of 1928. And you can see Francis Craig's group played for that. The bottom entry, also from spring 28, is the Sigma Nu dance. And you can see this was notated, it was in the gym at Vanderbilt. So WSM would bring out their equipment and broadcast. In the 1930s, as part of his work with the college circuit, the white Southeastern college circuit, Craig also broadcast pregame shows from the Hermitage Hotel before Vanderbilt's football games. He was a big football fan, and these shows included college songs such as Dynamite, the Vanderbilt fight song that Francis Craig wrote for his alma mater in 1938. In these pregame shows, he would also predict game scores and chat about football. Because his work on the Southeastern college circuit was such a key part of his career, I'd like to play some audio related to Dynamite. I think we also have some Commodore fans and alumni in attendance tonight, so this is for y'all. What you're going to hear in this audio is a 1962 interview on WSM radio, in which Craig discusses writing Dynamite, the Vanderbilt fight song. After that, you will hear an excerpt of a Glee Club version of the song that is undated. I don't know when that audio dates from. And then the third thing you will hear in this audio clip is a dance band version of the song. The dance band version was most likely played by the WSM Studio Orchestra, and it probably dates from the early 1940s. So let's listen to Francis Craig talk about Vanderbilt and then listen to two different versions of the Vanderbilt fight song, Dynamite.
Now let's see, you wrote some things for Vanderbilt. We're going to hear that. We played them a lot last fall. Tell us about Dynamite, how you came to write it.
Well, as you know, Vanderbilt has very, very few songs of their own. Their alma mater is borrowed from Cornell.
Mm-hmm.
And a bunch of the students asked me if I wouldn't try to write them a fight song that would be original by a Vanderbilt man, words and music, and they'd plug it and it might catch on. So I came up with Dynamite. The way I happened to think of Dynamite was Vanderbiltnt.
Yeah.
Dynamite, see? And TNT, of course, is dynamite, so I called it Dynamite.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we made an arrangement for the band, the Vanderbilt band, and they plugged it. Well, after a period of 2 or 3 years, it finally caught on, and I'm very proud and happy that they still seem to like Dynamite.
Well, we like it too. We played it last fall. Let's hear it again.
Dynamite, dynamite, when Bandy starts to fight, down the field with blood to yield, if need be, save the shield. If victory's won when battle's done, then Bandy's name will rise in fame. But win or lose, the fates will choose, and Bandy's game will be the same. Dynamite, dynamite, when Bandy starts to fight. Dynamite, dynamite, cheer for the gold and white.
Well, speaking of graduation day, Ernie, they're already talking about football at Vanderbilt. So let's listen to the Bandy fight song, Dynamite.
Say, Francis, who wrote that tune?
I'd rather not say.
Oh, you're bad, though.
And just a side note, in the 1920s and 30s, this is something I talk about in my book quite a lot. It was very common to hear non-marching band arrangements of fight songs. Students wanted to be able to dance to fight songs. They wanted dance band arrangements of them. They wanted the glee club to sing them. They wanted to be able to play them on pianos and mandolins and banjos. So just wanted you to get a peek into that world. Okay, back to our 1928 ledger, and let's finish up looking at what this document can tell us about Craig's career. He disappeared from the 1928 ledger entirely in the summer, and that was because his group was in Lansing, Michigan, playing gigs for the resort season. Craig often took this kind of summer gig in those years, so his absence from the ledger tells us something about his work at the time. When he reappeared in the WSM ledger in September of 1928, he was recorded as broadcasting not from the Hermitage Hotel, but from the Andrew Jackson Hotel. The Andrew Jackson was rival to the Hermitage and located 1 block away from it. The ledger also shows an important shift. In early October 1928, Craig's airtimes regularized into an actual show. His broadcasts moved to Sunday nights, and they adopted a catchier name. Depending on the ledger entry, they were called either the Rhythm Symphony or the WSM Rhythm Symphony Orchestra. 3 years later, in late 1931, NBC began airing this Sunday night show nationally. Even if NBC had not picked up Craig's Sunday night show, however, WSM's growing reach would have assured him some national exposure. In the early 1930s, WSM began broadcasting at 50,000 watts, meaning it could be heard in Hawaii, New Zealand, Ontario, Havana, Cuba, and even near the Arctic Circle. Moving on from the ledger here, I want to make a side note, even as we're spending so much time focusing on the Nashville institutions that built Craig's career, and he was geographically rooted in Nashville, but I do want to note that he did tour elsewhere, which helped establish his national profile. His touring was somewhat limited, but it was important in his career. For example, in 1930, he went to Colorado to recover from illness, and while he was in Colorado resting, a substitute band leader took his orchestra to St. Louis, Kansas City, and Dallas, which gained him more exposure. In 1932, after he was well from his illness, Craig went back to Colorado and he played extended gigs at hotels such as the Cosmopolitan in Denver, and you can see an ad for his group performing there on the left, and the iconic Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, which you can see pictured in a postcard of the period on the right. While he was in Colorado, he often broadcast on Denver's KOA, which was also picked up by NBC's Blue Network, more national exposure. He also played long hotel gigs in Dallas, for example. These kinds of tours, along with a few records that he cut for Columbia and Victor, networked Francis Craig into the national music industry. Additionally, his group nurtured musicians who went on to have noted careers of their own, such as Snooky Landon, Dinah Shore, and the tenor James Melton. So let's get back to Craig's home base in Nashville. As we can see from all of this, Francis Craig's career was anchored in a unique southern hub of the commercial music industry. It allowed him to transcend what could have been mere regional notoriety. This carved out a really unusual space for him between the world wars. He was a rare Southern musician who established a significant profile in mainstream popular music. A couple of other Southern dance band leaders at the time also gained national attention. Kay Kaiser of North Carolina comes to mind, for instance, but Craig was perhaps the best known out of this very small group. His unique position in the industry was highlighted by PR and media coverage that often referenced his Southern roots. And this is what I want to turn to next, is looking at how Craig was marketed as distinctively Southern. This started as early as 1925 with his records for Columbia, which he made in Atlanta. You heard an early example of those. Early in the talk, you heard an example of that. Columbia's marketing copy in 1925 described these records as somehow distinctively Southern. The copy called Craig's arrangement of Steady Roll Blues a splendid Southern number, for example. And the marketing copy went on to emphasize, quote, "These selections give the Southern boys ample opportunity to display the real Southern style of foxtrot," end quote. Now, Whether or not this was meaningful in any stylistic sense was secondary to the fact that the descriptor Southern was important in music marketing, and we'll come back to this later. Craig's 1930s PR continued to work the regional angle. An early 1930s press sheet from the William Morris Agency stated that Craig's group was, quote, the only Southern dance orchestra broadcasting over NBC networks. The press release called them, quote, America's foremost Southern band. WSM Radio's PR also framed Craig regionally in their 1930s materials. A typical WSM publication of the decade called him, quote, the South's greatest dance maestro who makes danceable history over the airwaves and at college proms in Dixie, end quote. The media in the 1930s also described Craig's work as somehow distinctively Southern. When he played in Dallas in fall 1932, the singer Alpha Louise Morton sang with his orchestra. The press described her as having, quote, a leisurely and dreamy quality, which is the spirit of the Old South. When Craig's orchestra played the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, the local press emphasized that he was a noted Southern musician. In the 1930s, New York media especially covered Craig's NBC radio broadcasts from the regional angle. And you can see a couple of examples of that coverage here. On the left, you can see from the New York Enquirer in 1937, you can see just the headlines there, Francis Craig piping majors up from Dixie, new praise for the Dean of Southern Maestros. And then you can see on the right, a cartoon from the New York Daily Mirror, also in 1937. And it is a sort of a caricature drawing of Francis Craig, and the tagline says, the musical toast of the South. One New York music critic wrote, quote, his melody is as intoxicating as Southern fried chicken. I'm going to play some audio of an NBC radio host introducing Francis Craig as the gentleman from the Deep South. This was very common in his radio and stage appearances at the time for him to be introduced this way. I just want you to hear some of that.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. You know, just the other day here in Hollywood, we were introduced to the miracle man of music of 1947, the modest chap who wrote and recorded that sensational selection, Near You. His name is Mr. Francis Craig. Well, what a thrill it was to meet this gentleman from the Deep South, to learn the true facts behind his meteoric rise to fame. We were so interested in his story that we asked him to join us on the Meet Your Music Makers program. And I'm very happy to say that Francis Craig accepted our invitation, and very soon he will make his first appearance at our microphone. Okay, Francis, suppose you start right at the beginning and tell us all about the biggest tune of 1947, your great composition, Near You.
Well, I ought to my way of...
And I just wanted you to hear how he was introduced as the gentleman from the Deep South. So we get it, right? Francis Craig was capital S Southern. So what did it mean to be labeled Southern in the interwar music industry? Were there different ways of being Southern in commercial music at the time? What kinds of music were Southerners really hearing and buying and making between the wars? And did that match what the music industry thought about Southern tastes at the time? I want to spend the rest of our time together thinking about how Craig's career can help us answer these questions. Let's start with considering what interwar music consumers understood the word Southern to mean. We have to back up to understand this. Whether or not Southern meant anything stylistically distinctive that you could hear in the music, the belief that a musician or musical product was Southern had mattered in commercial music since the early 20th century. As historian Karen Cox and other scholars have documented, Tin Pan Alley songs set in the South were popular in the opening decades of the century. Many of these so-called Dixie songs were written outside the South and published by New York publishing houses. Their lyrics and cover art reflected romanticized, nostalgic fantasies about the region, the Moonlight and Magnolias myth. Musically speaking, however, this sheet music sounded like the rest of mainstream Tin Pan Alley did. So it was at least established in the fledgling commercial music industry that just having the word South or Southern ideas or themes in your song would help it sell. Fast forward a couple of decades. Francis Craig's career was starting to pick up steam right at the same time that musical styles associated with the South emerged as new and important categories in recorded music. Between the early 1920s and early 1940s, basically Craig's career that we're looking at tonight, the recording industry launched two new categories: old-time or hillbilly music and race records. Old-time music, which eventually became country or country and western, was associated with the Southern white working class, especially of Appalachia. This music was promoted as reflecting pure, isolated Anglo-Saxon traditions. Although, as many scholars have documented, this was a fiction created in part by the music industry. Alternately, race records targeted Black consumers with blues and religious music. Record companies' marketing materials consciously associated race records with rural Southern working class Black life. And you can see a couple of visual examples here of how both of these categories were marketed in ways that had specific class, race, and regional associations. So old-time music or hillbilly music and race records were the dominant stylistic categories marketed as Southern between the two world wars in commercial music. But Francis Craig didn't fit into either of these categories. So what did people mean when they described his music as Southern? When the media described it this way, when his own press described it this way? Were people really hearing anything distinctively Southern about his sound or repertoire? It would be tough to make that case, especially after the 1920s when he moved away from hot jazz or Dixieland styles, and it's debatable that those styles would have coded Southern in the first place. Craig played mainstream dance orchestra music. His group played the same repertoire in the same style that national orchestra leaders such as Guy Lombardo and Paul Whiteman performed. Francis Craig's surviving sheet music library is largely made up of sentimental popular songs from the period. You can see here his copy of I Still Get a Thrill, printed in 1930, and you can see it was marketed with Craig on the cover. That meant that his group played it and he endorsed it. And this is a song that was recorded by major dance orchestra stars Guy Lombardo and the Canadians. There are many such examples in Craig's surviving sheet music. Craig did enjoy the occasional Southern-themed novelty song, but most of his repertoire was straightforward dance orchestra music. In the late 1920s, the Nashville Tennessean described his Sunday night broadcasts on WSM as, quote, concert music of the popular type, end quote. His brand of music was associated with modern, sophisticated urban audiences. That demographic was the opposite of the imagined social contexts for Southern music, like race records and old-time music. So media and PR references to Craig's Southern roots must have been referencing cultural markers other than musical style. One marker they indexed was his public persona. This included his heavy accent, which you've already heard, kind of an old-fashioned Southern accent, and his frequent references to his regional identity. In the audio you're about to hear, Francis Craig reminisces in the late 1940s about how he titled one of his songs, and he's very explicit and sort of self-aware about how his Southern background shaped the writing and titling of this song. I just want you to hear him talk about that.
You know, many tremendous numbers have been recorded in the last couple of years. Many sensational things like Cement Mixer, Peg of My Heart, Open the Door, Richard, and the Too Fat Polka, to mention just a few. Now, each of the above selections started a big flurry in musical circles. Everybody got busy trying to find a follow-up tune, but none were too successful. However, when Near You developed into the big hit that it is, you got busy and created a little melody which promises to be just as big, if not bigger, than Near You. And I'm referring to your latest composition, Beg Your Pardon. Say, Francis, before you play the number for us, how about telling us all about it?
Well, I wanted to try to do something that seems to be impossible. I wanted to try to follow up Near You, and I have no idea that it will be the thing that Near You is, but I thought I'd try anyway. So as you know, there's quite a saying throughout the country. You've been saying it all your life. Either I beg your pardon or pardon me. But down south, we cut out I beg your pardon. We cut out the I and generally say just beg your pardon.
So he was very self-aware about his Southern origins and Southern culture, and he referenced them frequently in media appearances and also on stage at times. Another marker of Craig's Southernness was his association with elite white Southern society. This yielded the perception in the entertainment industry that Craig represented a genteel, traditional Southern way of life. People seemed to see him as the archetype of the white Southern gentleman embedded in a timeless and paternalistic social matrix. For example, younger band members sometimes called him the Great White Father. A New York critic wrote in the 1930s, quote, "Every time I hear his mellow music emanating from down below the Mason-Dixon line, I feel like sending the old massa a wire of congratulations." Of course, Old Massa is a dialect rendering of Old Master, in other words, slang for how enslaved people were thought to refer to plantation owners. Some of this paternalistic framing came from Craig's employment of William Marquette.
You know, many tremendous numbers of...
William Marquette was a little African-American man who went by the nickname Pee-wee. He joined Craig's act as a comic figure and worked with him for many years. He was called in publicity materials and the media Craig's mascot. Oftentimes, he was called his Negro mascot. That was the language of the time that was used. Marquette appeared in PR photos and at shows in a bellhop or doorman's uniform, as you can see in this 1930s photo by Consolidated Radio Artists Management. This emphasized his subservient place within the Southern racial hierarchy. Using Black men as mascots in sports contexts was actually not uncommon in the pre-World War II South. This happened quite a bit with Southeastern Conference schools with their football teams. It happened at the University of Mississippi. It happened at the University of Georgia. It happened other places as well before World War II. Whatever anybody's personal sentiments or intentions may have been, it reinscribed a paternalistic racial hierarchy. The press noted that Marquette performed parts of Craig's act that were specifically associated with Black expressive culture. For example, a 1940 Billboard account said that Marquette added to the act's novelty by taking care of the bounce and jive and handling the scat stuff. Scat and jive were pretty explicitly associated with Black expressive culture at the time. Craig also was associated with social contexts that upheld the gender conventions of the white Southern elite, such as debutante balls and cotillions. This too was commonly mentioned in media accounts and coverage. In May 1948, a Kentucky paper wrote, "Francis Craig impresses folk here as a Southern gentleman," and the paper went on to call him, quote, "a virtual institution in the South, where 2 generations of debutantes have danced to his famous theme song, Red Rose," end quote. And that was the song that you heard that opened our presentation tonight. The Southern cultural markers associated with Craig may have included some Old South tropes, but they helped him build a New South career. Craig was part of a rapidly urbanizing South. From small-town Tennessee roots, he, along with many Southerners of multiple races, migrated to cities around World War I. Some of them, like the fans whose letters we mentioned earlier, left the South altogether. Between the 1890s and 1930, the percent of the Southern population living in Southern cities went from 10% to 33% of the region. Much of this growth came in interior cities such as Nashville, as opposed to Southern coastal cities. Craig was part of this trend. And in Nashville, he built a cosmopolitan career from innovative technology, new musical styles and repertoire, and urbane social contexts. Craig crafted a different kind of interwar Southern music career. Urbane, refined, playing mainstream popular music while still projecting nebulously Southern sensibilities. What his career tells us is that Southerners avidly consumed and produced mainstream popular music at the very moment that the music industry was working to define distinctive and narrow Southern musical tastes. In his book, Segregating Sound, Carl Hagstrom Miller argues that between 1890 and 1920, the music industry and folklore studies invented a Southern consumer who had uniquely Southern musical tastes, and he extends that argument to show how those tastes were racialized in an invented way. Miller shows that in reality, Southerners consumed and produced the same kind of mass-marketed music that many other Americans did, and often across the color line. Although Craig's career unfolded a bit later than the era that Miller is dealing with, it vividly extends and confirms Miller's argument. A clear example of this dynamic can be seen in the results of a 1930 Nashville Banner poll. The Nashville Banner was a newspaper in town at the time. And this is a poll of listeners' preferences for local radio acts. As you can hopefully see, even though the resolution is a little bit blurry, Francis Craig's orchestra was voted far and away the favorite local WSM radio act. And here's what I really want you to notice. His group outpaced the Grand Ole Opry by a couple of thousand votes and by several spots in the rankings. You can see that Francis Craig's group won the local radio favorite poll, and the Grand Ole Opry came in 5th place. Francis Craig's Southernized profile also highlights how the idea of the South has long served as a mythic or symbolic space. This was certainly true between the world wars. As Anthony Harkins and other scholars have noted, one way that Americans negotiated their anxieties in this time of social and economic turmoil was by treating Southern figures as archetypes or symbols that could help them reconcile the past with a swiftly changing present. Francis Craig was just such an archetype or symbol. His regional context, his sedate personality, his associations with elite Southern white society projected a sense of stability. For many listeners across the country, he represented a sense of continuity amidst change. In the post-war years, as his performing career was winding down, fan and media regard for Craig as uniquely Southern remained fixed. His 1947 hit Near You spawned a national tour in which the media highlighted his Southern roots, just as they had been doing for over 20 years. Newsweek called him in 1947 an unexpected Southern success. The Atlanta Journal described Craig's 1947 hit song as, quote, the story of a Southerner who hit the big time without leaving the South. In fact, Craig's 1947 song, Near You, was such a hit that Frank Sinatra sang a version of it on NBC Radio's Lucky Strike Hit Parade. This was either in 1947 or 1948. Afterwards, a listener wrote an angry letter to the program director to complain that Sinatra tried to, quote, juke up and ruin the melody of Francis Craig's song. The listener described Frank Sinatra's version of Francis Craig's song as, quote, lackadaisical. The letter writer was upset about this because, she noted, the song was written by one of the most well-known Southern band leaders. Those were her words. Her husband even added a note to the bottom of the letter. He complained that Frank Sinatra's version was, quote, lousy, smart-alecky, and smacked of sectional distinction, end quote. He went on to blame Frank Sinatra for juvenile delinquency and the decline of organized religion. This 1947 letter suggests that fans continued to see Craig as a symbol of tradition and stability amidst changing tastes and cultural values. Calling Francis Craig Southern always said more about Craig's social and cultural context than it did about his music. Francis Craig's story reminds us that Southern always sells in the music industry, even if nobody is ever quite sure exactly how it sounds.